All right, so let's switch gears now and talk about adolescent emotions. We've all endured adolescence, and I'm sure we remember how tough it can be managing our emotions during this time. So, first up, we're going to talk about the experience of emotions. So, adolescence is often described as being a roller coaster of emotions. You may have heard this phrase before. But how true is it? How true is this statement? How true is it that teenagers experience especially intense emotions and dramatic mood swings all the time? What does research say? Is this actually a characteristic of adolescence as a whole? Well, we can probably guess that studying emotional experiences is rather difficult. It can be tough to collect accurate data on emotions because they're very dynamic and they're not always quantifiable. But one promising way of examining emotions is the experience sampling method, ESM. So what happens here is that research participants, they receive regular text messages with links to surveys that they're filling out regularly throughout the day. So they're asked to describe recent positive and negative experiences, who they're with, where they are, how they feel. So throughout the day, they're receiving these texts to these surveys and they're filling them out in real time. So it's tracking their emotions throughout the day and all the possible factors that influence them, noticing patterns. So what were they doing and who were they with when these emotions were felt? So that's the ESM. And of course, this method is pretty rigorous, right? Participants' lives are regularly disrupted, so they can do these brief surveys several times a day. So it's pretty rigorous. That's definitely the big downfall of this method, but it is praised for its validity. It helps capture emotions in real time and detect patterns, which is not always possible when you do another type of method where you're just asking participants to reflect on, emotions that they experienced earlier that day, earlier that week, earlier that year. It's not going to be as accurate, right? Recalling from, a time ago. This is capturing them in real time. So that's definitely a benefit here of this method. So using the ESM, a longitudinal study was published that illustrated trends in emotional states from early to late adolescence. So the chart here illustrates some of those findings. So spanning from 5th grade all the way up to 12th grade, in this chart, we could see the average reported happiness is declining over time. So these lines represent. So the green line represents girls and the orange line represents boys. So we can see that for both groups, it was steadily declining average reported happiness. However, we might also notice that girls, the green line, they have generally higher levels of happiness than boys overall. We do see this gap between the two, right? So in other words, daily emotions became less positive over time. Another pattern found in the study is that emotions became less intense across adolescence, and those emotional ups and downs became less frequent. Not to mention, if stressful life events occurred, there were equal amounts of negative emotions across adolescence. Now, this suggests that there's not a certain period of adolescence where teenagers are particularly emotionally sensitive or reactive. It actually remains relatively stable over time. And these results were found in several countries. So all of these findings kind of challenge the idea that adolescents experience an emotional roller coaster. Um, this might actually be a poor metaphor for their emotional experience because in reality, according to at least this longitudinal study, their intensity, and the fluctuations of their emotions actually seem to decrease over time. And they don't seem to be hypersensitive to stressful events at any given point. And we know roller coasters have unpredictable bumps and turns every which way, right? This doesn't seem to accurately describe the experience of adolescence emotions over time based on what we can see here. So just something to think about. Now, what about regulating emotions? So one reason that adolescents' emotions become less intense and more stable over time, might be that they're better at controlling and regulating them in the first place. So things like impulse control, inhibition, persistence, these are things that encompass emotion regulation. And teenagers are grappling with these features and learning how to exercise them better. For example, if a scenario, let's say a teenager recently got a piercing and their mother is insulting it for the 100th time, saying it looks bad, they're so disappointed that they got it, something that the teen has been through quite a few times, they might start feeling upset and angry and frustrated, right? During this interaction. It's not a very pleasant interaction, right? But instead of lashing out in anger, maybe they step back and just retreat to their room instead, just leave the situation. This would be an example of an adolescent down regulating their negative emotions if they need to. So in this case, cooling down their anger. Now, another example is, let's say a teenager is invited to a party that all their friends are going to, but they have a biology exam the next day and they don't feel prepared for it, and they know that they struggle with biology, so they choose to stay home to study for the exam instead of going out. This takes a lot of willpower, of course, but this is an example of their growing ability to upregulate positive emotions when they need to. So in this case, they are mustering up enthusiasm for studying. It may not be genuine enthusiasm, but they're trying to hype themselves up, saying, okay, let's do this. We need to do this. So they're generating this enthusiasm when they need to. That'd be an example of upregulating. So just a couple examples of how teenagers are getting more advanced in their self-regulatory strategies and abilities, right? Now, teenagers who have difficulty regulating their emotions, they're more likely to experience things like depression, anger, and a variety of social and behavioral problems. So what contributes to an adolescent's emotion regulation? Why is it that some have more difficulty with it than others? So let's explore a couple uh, explanatory factors. So we'll start by talking about biological processes. As we know, there are pretty significant changes in the brain during adolescence. Also, we see the onset of puberty, going back a couple weeks to physical development. So all of this taken together with a spike in sensation seeking, we know that that's happening too. So they have this desire to participate in arousing activities. They are sensation seeking individuals. So this is said to be associated with pubertal hormones and the emotional intensity that arises from those hormones. Now, the brain, we can think of the brain as not always being able to keep up with regulating these intense emotions that they're feeling and the sensation seeking that they are seeking, right? Seeking out highly arousing activities. You could think of this as a perfect storm, making them more vulnerable to risk taking, to recklessness, to emotional problems. So bottom line is brain can't always keep up with these things. And this illustrates how biological processes can influence the maturity of an adolescent's emotional responses. Now, what about social processes? So how do family interactions and social expectations impact the expression and the regulation of emotions? So let's first look at parental interactions. There was one longitudinal study. It showed that if parents expressed warmth and positive emotions regularly toward their kid when they were young, when they were in elementary school, it predicted higher levels of emotion regulation when they reach early adolescence. And this predicted fewer behavior problems like aggression in middle adolescence. So it's kind of a trickling effect going all the way back to childhood. And was there warmth and positive emotions toward their child? This can contribute to later emotion regulation. So it seems that the emotional quality of parent-child interactions can have implications for regulation down the road. Now, what about gender role expectations? This is a big thing that permeates much of our society. So there's really big differences in how boys and girls are socialized in terms of managing emotions, right? So social conventions often represent girls as emotionally expressive and nurturing, and boys as independent and self-reliant. Not always, but these are the major trends that we do see in how girls and boys are socialized, the messages they're receiving. So there was one experiment that had teenagers take a math test on a computer, and the mother was there. And this math test was rigged for failure. So they were going to fail either way and receive a low score on their screen. And the point is to create, a frustrating or upsetting situation. So the teenager is likely to respond with some degree of frustration or disappointment in themselves. And then the mother was there, so we could see how the mother responds to their child's emotional expression. So what did the results show? Mothers of boys were less likely than mothers of girls to encourage their child's expression of these negative emotions that they may have experienced, like disappointment, frustration. So interesting stuff. We already see a difference there with boys and girls, how the mothers reacted. And this was especially true for the mothers who previously scored high on how much they adhere to traditional gender roles. So before this test was even done, mothers did a survey and they were shown scenarios like, I wouldn't allow my son to play with dolls, or men who cry have weak character. I guess not scenario, better word is statements. They were shown statements like this. And the mothers who agreed with these kinds of statements, these highly gendered statements, traditional gender roles, they were the ones who were more likely to inhibit their son's emotion expression during this experiment. So this reveals a lot about the differences in socialization between boys and girls. Even if it's not intentional, all parents are well-meaning, but a lot of times they do sway toward discouraging emotional expressions in their sons. Now, girls are typically considered more emotional than boys. This is a general belief that people hold, that girls experience emotions more intensely and they communicate them more willingly. People will say, this is just how it is, just how girls are. But maybe it's not the case. What if boys are experiencing emotions just as intensely as girls, but they have been trained to suppress the expression of them? What potential harm can come from this? So this leads us into our next portion, where we will talk about emotional health and well-being. But this is where we'll end this video. So thank you for joining, everyone, and I will see you as we continue along.